It's 3 a.m., May 29th, 1453. Inside the great church of Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent building on earth, 10,000 people are on their knees, soldiers, mothers, priests, children. Some of them have never prayed a day in their lives. Tonight, every single one of them is praying. They know the walls are breaking. They know the cannons have been firing for 55 days straight. They know their emperor rode out hours ago and has not come back. They are not praying to survive. They gave up on that. They are praying for a miracle, the same miracle that saved this city 18 times before. The miracle that turned back the Arabs, that stopped the Bulgarians, that held off every army that had ever dared to stand outside those walls. This time, it doesn't come. The fall of Constantinople, the day a 1,000-year empire died in a single morning. Before we get to the cannons, the blood, and the end of an empire, you need to understand just how impossible this conquest was supposed to be, because without that, the story is just a battle. With it, it's a tragedy. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had never fallen to a foreign army. Let that sink in. 1,000 years. While kingdoms rose and collapsed around it, while plagues wiped out half of Europe, while the Western Roman Empire crumbled into dust, Constantinople stood, unconquered, unbroken, not to the Persians, not to the Arabs, who tried twice in massive coordinated campaigns and failed both times, not to the Avars, the Bulgarians, the Russians, or the Vikings. The city had become something beyond a military stronghold. It had become a myth, a place that could not fall, chosen by God himself, people believed, to stand forever. And you could understand why they believed that, because look at where it was built. The city sat on a triangular peninsula where Europe meets Asia. On two sides, the Bosphorus Strait and the Golden Horn Inlet, deep, cold water that swallowed enemy fleets whole. On the third side, the land walls. And these were not ordinary walls. Built in the 5th century by Emperor Theodosius II, the Theodosian Walls were 3 layers deep. First, a moat 20 meters wide and filled with water, then a low outer wall. Then a higher inner wall with towers every 55 meters, each one packed with archers and boiling oil. The whole system stretched nearly 7 kilometers and had never, in over 1,000 years, been successfully breached from the outside. It wasn't just a wall, it was the greatest defensive engineering achievement in human history. And here is what makes this story completely insane. By 1453, the empire protected by those walls had almost entirely collapsed. The Byzantine Empire, once the beating heart of the Christian world, the keeper of Roman law, Greek philosophy, and centuries of accumulated knowledge, had been slowly dying for generations. Crusaders had sacked the city in 1204 and carved it up for themselves. The Black Death had torn through the population. Wars, betrayals, and bad emperors had eaten away at the territory piece by piece. By the time our story takes place, the Byzantine Empire was not an empire in any real sense. It was one city, Constantinople, surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory, cut off, isolated, a jewel sitting alone in the middle of enemy land. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, had exactly 7,000 men to defend 19 kilometers of wall. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had 80,000. Now let's talk about Mehmed, because he is one of the most fascinating figures in all of history, and most people have never heard of him. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old when he decided to take Constantinople. 21 years old. His own court thought he was reckless. His own Grand Vizier reportedly told him it was impossible. The walls had broken every army for 1,000 years. Why would this be any different? Mehmed didn't argue. He just started planning. He had been obsessed with Constantinople since he was a child. He studied it. He read every account of every failed siege he could find. He memorized the weaknesses, the geography, the history. To him, taking Constantinople was not ambition, it was destiny. He believed it was written that a great Muslim sultan would one day conquer the city of the Roman emperors, and he intended to be that sultan. So he did something revolutionary, something that no one had thought to do before him. He commissioned the largest cannon ever built in human history. The man he hired was a Hungarian engineer named Urban. And here is the darkest irony of this entire story. Urban had first gone to Constantinople and offered his services to Emperor Constantine. He told the emperor he could build weapons powerful enough to blast through any wall on earth. Constantine XI was interested, but the Byzantine treasury was empty. He couldn't afford it. Urban left Constantinople and went straight to Mehmed, who paid him 4 times what he had asked. The cannon Urban built, called the Royal One or Basilica, was a monster, 8 meters long, cast from bronze. It fired granite balls weighing over 500 kilograms. It took 60 oxen and 400 men just to drag it into position. Loading and firing it once took 2 hours, and when it finally fired for the first time during a test, it could be heard from 15 kilometers away. The ground shook. The shockwave alone reportedly caused injuries in nearby villages. This was not a weapon. It was a geological event. Now, I want you to sit with that question for a moment. The Byzantines had walls that had stopped every army for 1,000 years. Mehmed built a weapon specifically, deliberately, obsessively designed to destroy those walls. What happens next is almost inevitable. And yet, it took 55 days. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Every morning the cannons fired. The Basilica, the Royal One, could only fire 7 times a day. It had to cool between shots or it would crack apart. But 7 shots a day, every day, from a weapon that could shatter stone walls like dry clay was enough. Section by section, the great Theodosian Walls began to crack. And every night by torchlight the Byzantine defenders would haul rubble and fill in the gaps with wood, earth, barrels, anything they could find. And every morning the cannons would fire again. 55 days of this. 55 days of watching your city slowly eaten alive. Constantine sent letter after letter to Western Europe, to the Pope, to the King of Venice, to Genoa, to Hungary, begging for soldiers, for ships, for anything. A few ships arrived, then left. The Pope promised 5 warships. They came too late. The Golden Horn had already been sealed by an Ottoman chain, and a fleet of ships Mehmed had dragged overland on greased logs, one of the most audacious military maneuvers ever attempted. Bypassing the chain entirely, the city was surrounded, the walls were crumbling, and the people inside were running out of everything. On the night of May 28th, the last night, Emperor Constantine XI did something that history has never quite forgotten. He called together every soldier, every general, every nobleman, every Venetian and Genoese mercenary still left in the city. Men who had fought for weeks without rest. Men who knew with absolute certainty what the morning would bring. And he gave a speech. We don't have his exact words. The accounts that survive were written down later, from memory. But every historian who has studied them agrees. It was one of the most extraordinary speeches ever given by a leader facing certain death. He did not pretend they could win. He did not promise rescue. He asked them only to fight for their faith, for their families, for the city that had stood for 11 centuries. And then he did something that broke every man in the room. He asked for their forgiveness. For any wrong he had ever done to any of them, grown soldiers wept openly. That same night, the streets of Constantinople came alive one final time. A great candlelit procession moved through the city. Thousands of people carrying icons and crosses through the dark streets. Rich merchants beside beggars, Greek Orthodox beside Latin Catholics. People who had been bitterly divided for years, now shoulder to shoulder, united only by the knowledge that the morning would change everything. Constantine returned to Hagia Sophia and took communion. He embraced his court one by one. Then he rode to the walls. At midnight, every church bell in Constantinople began to ring at the same time. The sound rolled across the water, across the Ottoman camp, into the night sky. Mehmed gave the order. The assault began at 1:30 in the morning. Wave after wave came at the walls. The first waves were the irregulars, men Mehmed was willing to spend, sent forward to exhaust the defenders. For 2 hours the Byzantines held, barely, with broken weapons, with wounded hands. With sheer desperate will, they held. Then Mehmed sent the Janissaries. These were his elite, the finest soldiers in the Ottoman military, possibly the finest soldiers in the world at that time. Disciplined, rested, fresh, and tens of thousands strong. They hit the walls like a tide that does not stop. And then one unlocked door. A small gate in the wall, called the Kerkoporta, had been left open during an earlier sortie and never properly secured. It was a mistake. A human mistake, the kind of mistake that happens when exhausted men have been fighting for 55 days straight. A small group of Ottoman soldiers found it, pushed through, and suddenly there were enemy soldiers inside the walls. Within minutes, Ottoman banners were being raised on the battlements. When the defenders on the walls looked up and saw their own city flying enemy flags, something broke. The line collapsed. Men began to run. Constantine XI saw it happening. He saw the flags. He saw his men breaking. He knew it was over. He tore off his imperial robes and his insignia, the purple and gold that marked him as emperor, as the heir of Rome, as the last in a line that stretched back over 1,000 years. He tore them off so no one would know who he was. Then he drew his sword and ran toward the Ottoman soldiers. He was never seen again. His body was never officially identified. The last Roman emperor died in the streets of his city, anonymous, sword in hand, the way he wanted to go. Europe received the news and fell silent with horror. The Pope locked himself in his chambers. Kings held mourning masses. One Venetian diarist wrote words that have echoed through history. Today we have truly died. Because Constantinople was not just a city, it was the idea that something could last, that civilization once built could endure. It was the living connection to ancient Rome, to ancient Greece, to a world of philosophy and lore and art that predated Christianity itself. When it fell, the scholars fled. Thousands of them pouring into Italy carrying manuscripts, texts of Plato, Aristotle, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, works that Western Europe had not seen in centuries. They brought this knowledge into Florence, into Venice, into Rome, and many historians believe that flood of ancient knowledge was one of the key sparks that ignited the Italian Renaissance, that the death of one world breathed life into another. Mehmed II rode into the city on horseback later that day. He went straight to Hagia Sophia. He stood in the doorway of the greatest church ever built and looked up at its dome, 55 meters high, floating as if suspended from heaven. And he reportedly whispered a line of Persian poetry about the spider who now weaves curtains in the palace of the Caesars, and the owl who calls the night watch in the towers of Afrasiab. Even he understood what had ended. He ordered it converted to a mosque that same afternoon, and he gave himself a new title, Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was 21 years old. The Roman Empire, in one form or another, had existed for over 1,500 years. It had survived plagues, civil wars, barbarian invasions, religious upheaval, and the collapse of the entire Western world. It had outlasted every rival, every threat, every prophet of its doom. On a Tuesday morning in May 1453, it ended, not slowly, not with decline, with cannons and a 21-year-old who refused to accept impossibility, and one small door left open in the dark. If this video hit different, subscribe, because next we're going deeper into the man who built that cannon, Urban the Hungarian, and the question that should keep you up at night. What does it mean that the weapon that ended Rome was offered to Rome first? Drop a comment below. If you were Constantine XI,